Marcus watched the veterinarian load the lethal injection that would end his beloved mare's suffering, her massive belly swollen with what 3 different doctors had diagnosed as an inoperable tumor. Then Dr. Mitchell pressed her stethoscope against the dying horse's side and heard something that made her shout for everyone to stop. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go! The morning fog hung low over the rolling hills of Kentucky, clinging to the pastures like a shroud, as the veterinary truck made its way down the long gravel road toward Thornwood Stables. Dr. Sarah Mitchell gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white against the leather. In her 23 years of practice, she had performed this particular task more times than she cared to remember, but it never got easier. Today, she was being called to put down a horse, and something about this case had been gnawing at her since she received the call the night before. The owner of Thornwood Stables was a man named Richard Harrington, a wealthy businessman who had inherited the property from his late father, but had little interest in horses beyond their monetary value. His stable manager, a young man named Marcus Webb, had made the call with a voice that trembled with barely concealed emotion. There was a mare, he explained, a massive Shire horse named Bella, who had been declining for months. She had stopped eating properly, her belly had swollen to an alarming size, and she could barely stand. Richard had made the decision without hesitation. The horse was suffering, he said, and keeping her alive was simply throwing money away on a lost cause. The appointment was set for 8 in the morning, and there would be no changing his mind. As Dr. Mitchell pulled up to the stable, she noticed Marcus waiting by the entrance, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, as if he were holding himself together. He was a young man in his late 20s with weathered hands that spoke of years working with animals despite his age. When their eyes met, she saw something there that made her pause, a desperate hope mixed with profound sadness that told her this was not just any horse to him. "Thank you for coming, Doctor," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know this is just routine for you, but I need you to see her first. Really see her. Something doesn't feel right about this." Dr. Mitchell nodded slowly, sensing the weight behind his words. She had learned long ago to trust the instincts of those who worked closely with animals. They often noticed things that others missed, subtle changes in behavior or condition that could mean the difference between life and death. She followed Marcus through the stable, past rows of horses that watched them with curious eyes, until they reached the last stall at the far end of the building. Nothing could have prepared her for what she saw. Lying on a thick bed of golden straw was the largest mare she had ever encountered. Bella was a magnificent Shire horse, her coat a deep, lustrous black that seemed to absorb the morning light filtering through the stable windows. Even in her weakened state, there was an undeniable majesty about her, a presence that commanded respect and awe. But it was her belly that drew the doctor's attention, swollen to an enormous size that seemed almost impossible for any horse to carry. Marcus knelt beside Bella, his hand resting gently on her neck as he spoke to her in soft, soothing tones. The mare's eyes, dark and intelligent, followed his movements with a trust that spoke of a deep bond between them. "I've been with her every day for 3 years," he said without looking up. "She was already here when I started working at Thornwood. Nobody wanted anything to do with her because of her size. Said she was too big, too expensive to feed, not suitable for breeding or showing. But I saw something in her, Doctor. I saw a soul." Dr. Mitchell set down her bag and approached the mare slowly, her trained eyes taking in every detail. Bella's breathing was labored but steady, her ribs visible despite the massive swelling of her abdomen. The horse made no attempt to rise, but She did not seem to be in the acute distress that typically preceded the decision for euthanasia. Something was definitely wrong, but the veterinarian's instincts were screaming that this was not what everyone assumed it to be. "When did the swelling start?" she asked, pulling out her stethoscope. Marcus thought for a moment. "It's been gradual, maybe 4 or 5 months now. At first we thought she was just putting on weight. Mr. Harrington cut her feed, thinking she was getting fat, but she kept getting bigger, and then she started having trouble moving around. The vet who came last month said it was probably a tumor, something growing inside her that couldn't be removed. He said the kindest thing would be to let her go." Dr. Mitchell placed the stethoscope against Bella's swollen belly, closing her eyes to concentrate on the sounds within. What she heard made her freeze in place, her breath catching in her throat. She moved the instrument to another position, then another, her expression shifting from confusion to disbelief to something that looked almost like wonder. "Marcus," she said slowly, her voice carrying a tremor that had not been there before. "I need you to tell me something, and I need you to think very carefully before you answer. Has this mare ever been around a stallion? Even briefly, even if you didn't think anything happened?" Marcus frowned, trying to remember. There was an incident about 11 months ago. One of Mr. Harrington's business partners brought a stallion to board here temporarily. The stable hand who was supposed to be watching let the stallion out of his stall, and he got into the pasture where Bella was grazing. They were together for maybe 20 minutes before anyone noticed. But that was so long ago, and the other vet said there was no way she could be pregnant. He did an exam and said it was definitely a tumor. Dr. Mitchell stood up slowly, her mind racing through the possibilities. She had seen misdiagnoses before, had witnessed cases where what appeared to be one thing turned out to be something entirely different. But this would be extraordinary, something that would challenge everything she knew about equine reproduction and the limits of what was possible. "I need to do an ultrasound," she said, her voice firm with newfound determination. "Right now, before Mr. Harrington gets here. Because if I'm right about what I think I'm hearing, this changes everything. This mare isn't dying, Marcus, and what's inside her isn't a tumor." The next 30 minutes felt like an eternity as Dr. Mitchell rushed back to her truck to retrieve the portable ultrasound equipment. Marcus stayed with Bella, his hand never leaving her neck, whispering words of comfort that seemed to calm the massive mare, despite the tension that hung thick in the air. The stable was quiet, except for the occasional shuffle of hooves from the other horses, as if they too sensed that something momentous was about to unfold. When the doctor returned, she moved with a purpose that Marcus had not seen in her before. Gone was the resigned demeanor of someone preparing to end a life. In its place was the focused intensity of a professional who had discovered a mystery that demanded to be solved. She set up the ultrasound machine beside Bella, her fingers working quickly to prepare the equipment, while Marcus watched with a mixture of hope and fear churning in his stomach. "I need you to understand something," Dr. Mitchell said, as she applied the gel to Bella's swollen abdomen. "What I heard through my stethoscope should be impossible. Shire horses have a gestation period of about 11 months, sometimes a little longer. If she conceived during that incident you described, she would be extremely overdue by now. Pregnancies that go this long typically end badly for both the mare and the foal. But I heard heartbeats, Marcus. Multiple heartbeats." Marcus felt his own heart skip at her words. "Multiple? You mean she could be carrying twins? Doctor?" Mitchell shook her head slowly as the ultrasound machine hummed to life. "In horses, twin pregnancies are rare and almost always dangerous. The survival rate is very low, and most veterinarians recommend terminating one of the embryos early to give the other a chance. But what I heard suggested more than 2 heartbeats. I know it sounds crazy, but I need to see what we're dealing with." She pressed the ultrasound wand against Bella's belly, and the screen flickered to life with grainy images that meant nothing to Marcus but clearly meant everything to the veterinarian. Dr. Mitchell's eyes widened as she moved the wand slowly across the mare's abdomen, her lips parting in an expression of pure astonishment. She paused, adjusted the angle, and then let out a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Marcus, look at this. Do you see these shapes here? These are foals, living, breathing foals. And there's not just one or two." She counted silently, moving the wand to different positions to confirm what she was seeing. "There are 3 of them. This mare is carrying triplets, and somehow, against all odds, they're all alive." Marcus stared at the screen, trying to make sense of the swirling images. He could see movement now, tiny forms shifting within the confines of Bella's womb. Each one a miracle that should not exist. Tears welled up in his eyes as the reality of the situation began to sink in. For months, everyone had believed that Bella was dying, that the swelling in her belly was a death sentence that could not be appealed. But instead of a tumor consuming her from within, she had been nurturing new life, carrying a burden that would have been impossible for most horses to bear. "How is this possible?" he asked, his voice cracking with emotion. The other vets said she was dying. He was so sure. Dr. Mitchell turned off the ultrasound and sat back on her heels, her mind still reeling from what she had discovered. "I don't know how he missed it. Maybe the foals were positioned in a way that made them look like a mass on the initial exam. Maybe he didn't look closely enough because he had already made up his mind about what he would find. But what I can tell you is that this mare needs help, and she needs it now. A triplet pregnancy in a horse is virtually unheard of. The stress on her body must be enormous, which explains why she's been having trouble eating and moving. Her body is working overtime to support 3 lives." At that moment, the sound of tires on gravel cut through the stable's quiet. Marcus looked toward the entrance, his face draining of color as he recognized the sleek black Mercedes pulling up outside. Richard Harrington had arrived, and he was right on schedule. "That's the owner," Marcus said, panic creeping into his voice. "He's expecting you to put her down today. He won't care about the foals. All he sees is the cost of keeping her alive." "Doctor?" Mitchell stood up, squaring her shoulders with a determination that surprised even herself. "Then we need to make him care. This mare is about to do something that has never been documented in equine history. If those foals survive, it will be nothing short of a miracle. I am not going to stand by and let him destroy that because of money." The stabled doors swung open, and Richard Harrington strode in with the confidence of a man who was accustomed to having his orders followed without question. He was tall and impeccably dressed, his silver hair combed back in a style that spoke of expensive salons and country club memberships. His eyes swept over the scene before him with obvious impatience, lingering on the equipment scattered around Bella's stall. "Dr. Mitchell, I presume?" he said, his voice clipped and businesslike. "I was told this would be a simple procedure. Why does it look like you're setting up a field hospital?" Dr. Mitchell met his gaze without flinching. "Mr. Harrington, there's been a significant development that changes everything. This mare is not dying from a tumor. She's pregnant, and she's carrying 3 foals. Triplets. It's unprecedented, and if we can help her deliver safely, it could be one of the most remarkable events in veterinary history." Richard's expression did not change, but something flickered behind his eyes. A calculation that had nothing to do with compassion and everything to do with opportunity. 3 foals, you say? And what exactly would something like that be worth? Marcus felt his stomach turn at the question, but Dr. Mitchell did not miss a beat. "That depends entirely on whether they survive, Mr. Harrington, and right now, that's not a guarantee. This mare needs specialized care, around-the-clock monitoring, and a cesarean section that will require a full surgical team. The question is whether you're willing to invest in a miracle or walk away from the chance of a lifetime." The silence that followed seemed to stretch into infinity as Richard Harrington looked from the doctor to the mare to the young stable hand who had dedicated years of his life to an animal no one else wanted. In that moment, the fate of 4 lives hung in the balance. Richard Harrington was not a man who made decisions based on sentiment. He had built his fortune through calculated risks and cold analysis, never allowing emotion to cloud his judgment. As he stood in the stable looking down at the massive mare who lay helpless in the straw, his mind was already running through the numbers. The cost of specialized veterinary care, the surgical fees, the round-the-clock monitoring that Dr. Mitchell had mentioned, all of it added up to a significant investment with no guaranteed return. But the potential reward, being the owner of the only surviving equine triplets in recorded history, that was the kind of distinction that money alone could not buy. "How long until she delivers?" he asked, his tone shifting from dismissive to curious. Dr. Mitchell recognized the change immediately. She had dealt with wealthy clients before, men and women who viewed animals as assets rather than living beings. The key to reaching them was speaking their language, presenting the situation in terms they could understand and appreciate. She chose her next words carefully, knowing that Bella's life and the lives of her unborn foals depended on how convincingly she could make her case. "Based on the size and development of the foals, I estimate she could go into labor within the next week, possibly sooner. The pregnancy has already gone significantly longer than normal, which is actually working in our favor. The foals appear to be fully developed, which increases their chances of survival if we can manage the delivery properly. But I won't lie to you, Mr. Harrington, this is going to be complicated. Her body is under tremendous strain, and a natural birth is almost certainly out of the question. We'll need to perform a cesarean section in a proper surgical facility." Richard nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving the mare. "And if we do nothing? If we proceed with the original plan?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Marcus, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, felt a surge of anger rise in his chest. How could anyone stand in the presence of such a miracle and still contemplate destruction? But before he could speak, Dr. Mitchell raised her hand in a subtle gesture that told him to hold his tongue. "If we proceed with euthanasia," she said, her voice steady, despite the weight of her words, "you will be ending 4 lives, not 1. 3 foals who have defied every odd to survive this long will die without ever taking their first breath. And Bella, who has carried them with a strength that borders on the miraculous, will have suffered through months of hardship for nothing. I understand that this is a business decision for you, Mr. Harrington, but some opportunities only come once in a lifetime." Richard was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant as he weighed his options. Then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. "Very well. Do whatever you need to do to save them. Marcus, you're in charge of making sure she has everything she needs. I want updates every 6 hours, and I want to know immediately if anything changes. This had better be worth it." With that, he turned and walked out of the stable, leaving behind a wake of relief so palpable that Marcus felt his knees go weak. He looked at Dr. Mitchell with eyes that glistened with unshed tears, gratitude and disbelief warring for dominance on his face. "You did it," he breathed. "You actually convinced him?" Dr. Mitchell allowed herself a small smile, but her expression quickly turned serious. "The hard part is just beginning. I meant what I said about the risks. Triplet pregnancies in horses are virtually unheard of because they almost never survive. The foals compete for resources in the womb, and the mare's body isn't designed to support that kind of demand. The fact that Bella has made it this far is nothing short of extraordinary. But we're not out of the woods yet. Not by a long shot. Over the next several days, Thornwood Stables transformed from a neglected property into a hub of focused activity. Dr. Mitchell called in favors from colleagues across the state, assembling a team of specialists who dropped everything to be part of what they were already calling a historic case. A temporary surgical suite was constructed in the largest barn, equipped with everything they would need to perform the cesarean section when the time came. Monitors were set up around Bella's stall, tracking her vital signs and the heartbeats of her 3 foals with constant vigilance. Marcus barely slept during those days, spending every available moment at Bella's side. He talked to her in soft, reassuring tones, telling her about the new life that awaited her once this was all over. He described the green pastures where she would watch her foals take their first steps, the warm sun that would shine down on them as they grew strong and healthy. Whether she understood his words or simply responded to the love in his voice, Bella seemed to draw comfort from his presence. Her breathing grew steadier, and some of the tension that had gripped her massive frame began to ease. The night before the scheduled surgery, Marcus sat alone with Bella in the quiet of the stable. The other horses had settled into sleep, and the only sounds were the soft hum of the monitoring equipment and the gentle rhythm of Bella's breathing. He rested his head against her neck, feeling the warmth of her body and the steady beat of her heart. "You're going to make it through this, girl," he whispered. "You and your babies. I know you're tired, and I know you're scared, but you're the strongest horse I've ever known. You've been fighting this whole time, even when everyone else had given up on you. Just hold on a little longer. Tomorrow, everything changes." Bella turned her great head toward him, her dark eyes reflecting the dim light of the stable. In that gaze, Marcus saw something that he would carry with him for the rest of his life, a trust so complete and unwavering that it transcended the boundaries between species. She was placing her life in his hands, and he silently vowed that he would not let her down. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Dr. Mitchell arrived with her team. The day of reckoning had come, and there was no room for doubt or hesitation. 4 lives hung in the balance, and every person present understood the magnitude of what they were about to attempt. The surgical team moved with practiced precision as they prepared Bella for the procedure that would determine her fate and the fate of her 3 unborn foals. Dr. Mitchell had assembled the finest equine surgeons in the region, professionals who had performed countless cesarean sections throughout their careers, but had never faced anything quite like this. The atmosphere in the makeshift surgical suite was tense but focused, each person acutely aware of the historical significance of what they were about to attempt. Marcus stood just outside the sterile zone, his hands gripping the wooden railing so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. He had wanted to be inside with Bella, to hold her head and whisper reassurances as she drifted into unconsciousness. But Dr. Mitchell had gently but firmly explained that the surgical area needed to remain as controlled as possible. Too many variables could mean the difference between success and catastrophe, and they could not afford to take any unnecessary risks. The anesthesiologist administered the sedative with careful precision, monitoring Bella's vital signs as she slowly succumbed to the medication. Her eyes, which had been fixed on Marcus through the observation window, gradually grew heavy and finally closed. The massive mare's breathing deepened and steadied as the anesthesia took full effect, and the surgical team moved into position around her swollen abdomen. Dr. Mitchell made the first incision with steady hands, cutting through layers of muscle and tissue with the skill of someone who had dedicated her life to the care of these magnificent animals. Blood welled up along the incision line, quickly absorbed by the surgical sponges that her assistants pressed against the wound. The monitors beeped steadily in the background, tracking every heartbeat, every breath, every subtle change in Bella's condition. As the incision widened, the reality of what lay within became visible for the first time. The womb was distended beyond anything the surgeons had ever seen, stretched to accommodate 3 lives that had grown together in impossible circumstances. Dr. Mitchell paused for just a moment, allowing herself to absorb the magnitude of what she was seeing before pressing forward with renewed determination. "First foal is presenting," she announced, her voice calm and professional, despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Preparing for extraction." The team worked in seamless coordination as they carefully maneuvered the first foal through the incision. It was a filly, her coat a stunning silver gray that seemed to shimmer even under the harsh surgical lights. She emerged into the world silent and still, her tiny body limp in the hands of the waiting veterinary nurses. For one terrible moment, Marcus felt his heart stop. After everything they had been through, after all the hope and preparation and sleepless nights, had they been too late? Then, with a suddenness that made everyone in the room gasp, the filly jerked and drew her first breath. Her legs kicked weakly, instinctively searching for the solid ground that would one day support her as she ran through open pastures. A cheer erupted from the surgical team, quickly stifled as they remembered that the procedure was far from over. 2 more foals remained, and every second that passed increased the risk of complications. The second foal was a colt, his coat as black as his mother's, a miniature version of the magnificent Mare, who had carried him against all odds. He emerged more easily than his sister, his lungs filling with air almost immediately as he announced his arrival with a high-pitched whinny that echoed through the surgical suite. Marcus felt tears streaming down his face as he watched through the observation window, overwhelmed by the miracle unfolding before his eyes. But as Dr. Mitchell reached for the third and final foal, her expression changed. Something was wrong. The monitors began to beep more rapidly, and the surgical team's movements took on a new urgency that sent ice through Marcus's veins. He pressed closer to the window, desperate to see what was happening but dreading what he might witness. "The third foal is tangled in the umbilical cord," Dr. Mitchell said, her voice tight with concentration. "I need more room to work. Someone get me the surgical scissors, now." The next few minutes stretched into an eternity as the surgeon worked to free the trapped foal. Each second felt like a lifetime, each beep of the monitor a reminder that time was running out. Marcus found himself praying, something he had not done since he was a child, bargaining with whatever higher power might be listening to spare this innocent life that had fought so hard to exist. Finally, with a gentleness that belied the urgency of the situation, Dr. Mitchell lifted the third foal from its mother's womb. It was another filly, smaller than her siblings, her coat a beautiful mix of black and gray that seemed to capture the best of both colors. But unlike her brother and sister, she did not move. She did not breathe. She lay motionless in the surgeon's hands, her tiny body as still as death. "No," Marcus whispered, his voice cracking. "No, please, no." Dr. Mitchell did not hesitate. She handed the filly to her most experienced nurse and barked orders for resuscitation equipment. The team worked frantically, rubbing the foal's body to stimulate circulation, clearing her airways, doing everything within their power to coax life into the fragile form. The monitors continued their relentless beeping, a mechanical chorus that seemed to mark the passing of hope with each electronic note. 1 minute passed, then 2. The surgical team's movements grew more desperate, their faces etched with the kind of grief that comes from watching a life slip away, despite every effort to hold it back. Marcus could not watch anymore. He turned away from the window, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs as he mourned the loss of a life that had never had a chance to begin. And then, cutting through the despair like a ray of sunlight, breaking through storm clouds, came a sound that made everyone freeze. It was weak at first, barely audible over the beeping monitors and the rustle of surgical gowns. But it grew stronger with each passing second, a defiant cry that refused to be silenced. The third filly was breathing. Marcus spun back toward the window, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing. There, cradled in the nurse's arms, the smallest of Bella's triplets was moving her legs and crying out with all the strength her tiny lungs could muster. She was alive. Against every odd, defying every expectation, she was alive. The surgical suite erupted in a chaos of emotion and activity as the team processed what had just occurred. 3 foals, all alive, all breathing, had been delivered from a mare that everyone had written off as terminal just days before. Dr. Mitchell allowed herself a moment to close her eyes and breathe, the weight of what they had accomplished settling over her like a warm blanket. But her reprieve was brief. Bella's incision still needed to be closed, and the mare's vital signs required constant monitoring as she recovered from the anesthesia. Marcus burst through the doors, no longer able to maintain his distance from the miracle he had helped bring about. He rushed to where the 3 foals lay wrapped in warming blankets, each one attended by a dedicated nurse, who monitored their breathing and heart rates with unwavering attention. The silver-gray filly, the firstborn, had already begun to show signs of her mother's strength, her legs moving with increasing coordination as she tried to understand this strange new world she had entered. The black colt beside her was equally vigorous, his dark eyes bright with curiosity as they darted around the room. But it was the smallest filly, the one they had almost lost, who captured Marcus's heart completely. She was noticeably smaller than her siblings, her body more fragile, her movements less confident. Yet there was something in her eyes, a spark of determination that seemed to say she had fought too hard to get here to give up now. Marcus knelt beside her, his hand trembling as he reached out to touch her soft, damp coat. "You're a fighter," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Just like your mother. You weren't supposed to make it. But here you are. Here you all are. Doctor." Mitchell approached him, stripping off her surgical gloves as she walked. Her face was drawn with exhaustion, but her eyes shone with a satisfaction that transcended mere professional accomplishment. "They're going to need round-the-clock care for the next several weeks," she said, her voice gentle but serious. "Triplet foals have never survived before, and there's a reason for that. They'll be competing for their mother's milk, and the smallest one may not be able to hold her own against her siblings. We'll need to supplement with bottle feeding and make sure each of them gets the nutrition they need." Marcus nodded without taking his eyes off the tiny filly. "Whatever it takes. I'll do whatever it takes." Over the next several hours, Bella slowly emerged from the anesthesia. Her recovery was complicated by the trauma her body had endured, not just from the surgery, but from the months of carrying a burden that should have been impossible. She was weak and disoriented, her massive frame trembling as she tried to comprehend what had happened. But when the first of her foals was brought to her side, something remarkable occurred. The silver-gray filly, still unsteady on her newborn legs, was placed in the straw beside her mother. Bella lifted her great head with effort, her nostrils flaring as she caught the scent of her offspring for the first time. A low, rumbling sound emerged from her throat, something between a whinny and a sigh, and she reached out to nuzzle her daughter with a tenderness that brought tears to the eyes of everyone watching. The filly responded instinctively, pressing closer to her mother's warmth, her tiny body relaxing in the presence of the one who had given her life. One by one, the other foals were introduced to their mother. The black colt was bold and curious, immediately trying to nurse despite his wobbly legs. The smallest filly was more hesitant, hanging back as if unsure whether she belonged in this family reunion. But Bella would have none of that. She reached out with her muzzle and drew the tiny foal closer, accepting her without reservation, welcoming her into the fold as if her size and weakness meant nothing at all. Marcus watched the reunion from the corner of the stall, his heart so full that he thought it might burst. He had spent years caring for animals that no one else wanted, pouring his love into creatures that society had deemed worthless or beyond saving. But he had never experienced anything like this. These 4 lives, intertwined by fate and circumstance, represented something that went beyond his understanding. They were proof that miracles could happen, that hope could triumph over despair, that love could defy the impossible. As the day wore on, word of the successful delivery spread beyond Thornwood Stables. Dr. Mitchell had contacted several veterinary journals and news outlets, knowing that the scientific community would want to document this unprecedented event. By evening, the first reporters had arrived, their cameras and microphones capturing images of the 4 horses that had defied every odd to be together. Richard Harrington, who had been conspicuously absent during the surgery, appeared just as the sun was setting. He surveyed the scene with the calculating eye of a businessman assessing his investments, taking in the media presence, the excited veterinary team, and the 4 horses at the center of it all. Marcus braced himself for whatever the owner might say, half expecting him to try to take credit for a miracle he had nearly prevented. But Richard surprised him. He walked slowly to the stall where Bella lay with her foals, and for a long moment he simply watched. Something shifted in his expression as he observed the mare tenderly caring for her offspring, her strength evident even in her weakened state. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than Marcus had ever heard it. "I almost had her killed," he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. "I almost destroyed all of this, because I couldn't see beyond the numbers." Dr. Mitchell stepped forward, her tone measured but kind. "You made the right choice when it mattered, Mr. Harrington. That's what counts." Richard shook his head slowly. "No. Marcus made the right choice when he called you instead of accepting my decision. I just got lucky enough to listen." He turned to the young stable hand, meeting his eyes directly for perhaps the first time since they had known each other. "These horses are yours now. Legally, officially, yours. I'll have my lawyers draw up the papers tomorrow." Marcus stared at him, unable to process what he was hearing. "Sir, I don't understand. These foals alone could be worth a fortune." Richard smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his usually stern features. "Some things are worth more than money. Consider it a lesson I should have learned a long time ago." The weeks that followed the miraculous birth were among the most challenging and rewarding of Marcus's life. True to Dr. Mitchell's warning, caring for triplet foals proved to be an around-the-clock endeavor that left little room for sleep or rest. Each day brought new obstacles to overcome, new milestones to celebrate, and new reasons to marvel at the resilience of the 4 horses who had become his entire world. The 2 larger foals, whom Marcus had named Storm and Shadow after their distinctive coloring, grew stronger with each passing day. Storm, the silver-gray filly, had inherited her mother's commanding presence and seemed to understand instinctively that she was the eldest of the three. She was always the first to nurse, the first to explore new corners of the paddock, the first to test her legs in awkward attempts at running that made everyone who watched her laugh with delight. Shadow, the black colt, was more playful and mischievous, constantly getting into trouble and then looking at Marcus with innocent eyes as if to say he had no idea how that bucket had been knocked over. But it was the smallest filly, the one Marcus had named Hope, who required the most attention. Despite surviving her traumatic entry into the world, Hope struggled to compete with her larger siblings for their mother's milk. She was consistently pushed aside during feeding times, her small body no match for Storm's assertiveness or Shadow's boundless energy. Within the first week, it became clear that without intervention, Hope would not survive. Marcus took it upon himself to become Hope's primary caregiver. He set alarms throughout the night to wake himself for bottle feedings, mixing the specialized formula that Dr. Mitchell had prescribed and holding the bottle steady as Hope drank with an eagerness that belied her fragile appearance. During those quiet midnight hours, alone in the stable with only the sound of Hope's suckling and the gentle breathing of the sleeping horses, Marcus felt a connection forming that transcended anything he had experienced before. He talked to her during those feedings, sharing his thoughts and dreams, as if she could understand every word. He told her about his childhood on a small farm in Tennessee, where he had first discovered his love for horses. He spoke of his parents, hard-working people who had taught him that every creature deserved compassion and care, regardless of its value in the eyes of the world. He confided his fears that he was not good enough, not smart enough, not experienced enough to give these four horses the life they deserved. Hope would look up at him with her large, trusting eyes, her small tail swishing contentedly as she drank. And somehow, Marcus would find the strength to keep going. The media attention surrounding the triplets grew exponentially as word spread across the country and then around the world. News crews from major networks descended on Thornwood stables, their cameras capturing every adorable moment of the foal's development. Veterinary journals published detailed accounts of the pregnancy and delivery, hailing it as an unprecedented event in equine history. Scientists and researchers requested permission to study the triplets, hoping to understand how they had survived when so many others before them had not. Marcus found himself thrust into a spotlight he had never sought and did not particularly enjoy. He was interviewed dozens of times, asked to recount the story of how he had convinced Dr. Mitchell to take a closer look at Bella, how he had stood vigil during the surgery, how he had fought to keep Hope alive during those critical early weeks. He answered every question with humble honesty, always redirecting the credit to Bella, whose strength had made everything possible, and to Dr. Mitchell, whose expertise had turned a death sentence into a miracle. Through it all, Richard Harrington remained true to his word. The legal documents transferring ownership of Bella and her foals to Marcus were signed and finalized within days of the surgery. But Richard did more than simply give away his horses. He established a trust fund to cover their care, ensuring that Marcus would never have to worry about the financial burden of raising 4 horses on a stable hand's salary. He also offered Marcus the position of head stable manager at Thornwood, a role that came with a significant raise and the freedom to run the facility as he saw fit. It was an offer that changed Marcus's life completely. No longer just an employee following orders, he was now the guardian of the most famous horses in the world, and the caretaker of a property that had been transformed from a neglected holding into a destination for horse lovers everywhere. People came from distant states just to catch a glimpse of the triplets, to take photographs with Bella, to hear Marcus tell the story of how 4 lives had been saved by the simple act of paying attention. As spring turned to summer, the foals continued to grow and thrive. Storm had developed into a natural leader, her movements graceful and confident as she led her siblings on explorations of the expanding paddock. Shadow had channeled his mischievous energy into impressive displays of speed, racing across the grass with a joy that was infectious to everyone who watched. And Hope, the miracle filly who had fought so hard just to breathe, had begun to catch up with her siblings in size and strength. Dr. Mitchell visited regularly, marveling at the progress of her most remarkable patients. During one such visit, as she watched the three foals playing together under the watchful eye of their mother, she turned to Marcus with an expression of wonder. "You know, in all my years of practice, I've never seen anything like this," she said softly. "Triplet foals are supposed to be impossible, even when they're born alive. They almost never survive the first few weeks. But look at them now. They're not just surviving, Marcus. They're thriving." Marcus nodded, his eyes never leaving the foals. Bella never gave up on them, not for a single moment. She carried them when her body was telling her it couldn't be done. She nurtured them when every instinct should have said to choose the strongest and let the others go. She taught me what real strength looks like. Dr. Mitchell smiled. She taught all of us. But you were the one who listened. As the sun began to set over Thornwood Stables, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold, Marcus watched his 4 horses grazing peacefully in the pasture. The fame that had descended upon Thornwood Stables brought with it opportunities that Marcus had never imagined possible. Offers poured in from around the world, each one more lucrative than the last. Wealthy collectors wanted to purchase the triplets for astronomical sums. Television producers proposed reality shows that would document every moment of their lives. Pharmaceutical companies sought exclusive rights to study them, promising research breakthroughs that could revolutionize equine reproduction. The numbers being thrown around were staggering, enough money to transform Marcus from a humble stable hand into a wealthy man overnight. But Marcus refused every offer without hesitation. These horses were not commodities to be bought and sold. They were family, bound to him by an experience that transcended monetary value. He had held Hope in his arms when she was struggling to breathe, had whispered encouragement to Bella during her darkest hours, had watched Storm and Shadow take their first wobbly steps into the world. No amount of money could compensate for the bonds that had formed in those moments of vulnerability and triumph. Not everyone understood his decision. Some called him foolish, a naive idealist who was throwing away a fortune for sentimental reasons. Others accused him of being selfish, hoarding the triplets when they could be contributing to scientific advancement or bringing joy to other families. The criticism stung, but Marcus remained steadfast in his conviction. He knew in his heart that Bella and her foals belonged exactly where they were, and no amount of outside pressure would change his mind. As the months passed, the media frenzy gradually subsided. The triplets were no longer breaking news, just another heartwarming story that people remembered fondly but no longer actively followed. The crowds that had once lined up outside Thornwood Stables dwindled to a trickle, and eventually the property returned to something resembling its former quiet. For Marcus, this was a relief. He had never wanted fame or attention, only the chance to care for the animals he loved. With the spotlight dimmed, Marcus was able to focus on what truly mattered, raising the triplets and ensuring that Bella recovered fully from her ordeal. The massive mare had regained much of her strength in the months since the surgery, her coat regaining its lustrous shine and her movements becoming more confident with each passing day. But there were moments when Marcus caught her standing alone in the pasture, her eyes distant, and her breathing labored, and he worried that the trauma of carrying 3 foals had taken a toll that might never fully heal. Dr. Mitchell shared his concerns during one of her routine visits. She examined Bella thoroughly, taking blood samples and listening to her heart with the same focus she had shown on that fateful morning when everything changed. When she finished, her expression was thoughtful but not alarmed. "Her heart has been under significant strain," she explained to Marcus. "Carrying triplets pushed her body to its absolute limits. She's recovered remarkably well, all things considered, but she'll never be quite the same horse she was before. She needs a life of peace and comfort now. No stress, no demands, just gentle care and lots of love." Marcus nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "She'll have that. I'll make sure of it." True to his word, Marcus dedicated himself to creating the perfect retirement for Bella. He converted the largest paddock into her personal sanctuary, planting shade trees and installing a small pond where she could drink fresh water whenever she wished. He built a custom shelter that protected her from the elements while still allowing her to feel the breeze and watch her foals playing in the adjacent fields. Every detail was designed with her comfort in mind, a tribute to the mare who had given so much. The triplets, meanwhile, were growing into remarkable horses in their own right. Storm had developed a regal bearing that commanded attention wherever she went, her silver-gray coat gleaming like moonlight on water. She had inherited her mother's intelligence and seemed to understand things that other horses did not, responding to Marcus's commands with an uncanny awareness that sometimes felt almost supernatural. Trainers who visited the stables marveled at her potential, predicting that she could become one of the finest show horses of her generation. Shadow had channeled his early mischievousness into an impressive athleticism. He was the fastest of the 3, his black form streaking across the pastures with a speed that left observers breathless. His playful nature had evolved into a charismatic personality that drew people to him, and he seemed to genuinely enjoy the attention. Marcus often joked that Shadow was the showman of the family, always performing for an audience, even when none was present. And then there was Hope, the miracle filly who had defied death to join her siblings in the world. She had grown significantly since those terrifying first days, but she would always be smaller than Storm and Shadow. What she lacked in size, however, she more than made up for in spirit. Hope had developed an extraordinary sensitivity to the emotions of those around her, seeming to know instinctively when someone needed comfort or companionship. She would approach visitors who were sad or anxious and stand quietly beside them, her gentle presence offering a peace that words could not provide. It was this unique gift that led to an opportunity Marcus had never anticipated. A local therapy organization reached out to him, explaining that they were looking for horses to participate in their equine-assisted therapy program. They had heard about Hope's gentle nature and wondered if she might be suitable for working with children who had experienced trauma or were struggling with emotional challenges. Marcus was hesitant at first, protective of Hope, and worried about exposing her to unfamiliar environments. But when he discussed the possibility with the doctor, Mitchell, she encouraged him to consider it seriously. Horses like Hope, she explained, were rare and precious. Her ability to connect with humans on an emotional level was a gift that could help others, giving her life even greater purpose and meaning. After much deliberation, Marcus agreed to a trial session. He loaded Hope into a trailer and drove her to the therapy center, his heart pounding with anxiety the entire way. He had no idea what to expect, no way of knowing whether his beloved filly would thrive in this new role or be overwhelmed by it. What happened next would change everything once again. The therapy center was a modest facility nestled in the countryside. its grounds dotted with gentle hills and quiet gardens designed to promote healing and peace. Marcus led Hope from the trailer with careful attention, watching for any signs of distress or discomfort. But the small filly seemed remarkably calm. Her ears perked forward with curiosity as she took in her new surroundings. She walked beside Marcus with the quiet confidence she had developed over the past year, trusting him completely to guide her wherever they needed to go. The program director, a warm woman named Eleanor, who had dedicated her life to helping troubled children, met them at the entrance to the stable area. She explained that their first client would be a 7-year-old girl named Lily, who had stopped speaking after witnessing a traumatic accident that had claimed her mother's life. For months, therapists had tried every approach imaginable to reach her, but Lily had retreated into a silence so complete that some feared she might never speak again. Marcus felt his stomach tighten with apprehension. This was so much more serious than he had anticipated. What if Hope could not help? What if her presence made things worse? He looked at his beloved filly, searching for some sign that she was ready for this responsibility. Hope returned his gaze with those large, trusting eyes that had captivated him from the very beginning. And somehow, he found the courage to proceed. Lily arrived with her grandmother, a tired-looking woman whose face bore the unmistakable marks of grief and worry. The little girl was painfully thin, her blonde hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, her eyes fixed on the ground, as if she could not bear to look at the world around her. She moved like a ghost, present, but not quite there, following her grandmother's gentle guidance without any apparent awareness of where she was going. Eleanor led them to the paddock where Hope waited, explaining in soft tones what would happen during the session. There was no pressure, she assured them. Lily could simply be in Hope's presence, nothing more. Sometimes, Eleanor explained, the simple act of being near a gentle animal could unlock doors that human intervention could not open. Marcus stood at the fence, watching as Lily was led into the paddock. Hope, who had been grazing peacefully, lifted her head at the girl's approach. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The filly studied the child with an intensity that Marcus had never seen before, her nostrils flaring slightly as she took in Lily's scent. Then, with a gentleness that took everyone's breath away, Hope walked slowly toward the little girl. Lily's grandmother gasped, instinctively reaching out to pull her granddaughter back, but Eleanor placed a reassuring hand on her arm, silently urging her to wait. Hope stopped just inches from Lily, lowering her head until her muzzle was level with the child's face. And then she did something extraordinary. She breathed out slowly, a warm exhalation that ruffled Lily's hair and seemed to envelop her in a cocoon of comfort. Something changed in Lily's expression. The blankness that had dominated her features for so long flickered, replaced by something that looked almost like wonder. Her small hand, which had hung limply at her side, rose tentatively toward Hope's face. When her fingers made contact with the filly's soft coat, a sob escaped her lips. The first sound she had made in months. What followed was nothing short of miraculous. Lily began to cry, great heaving sobs that shook her tiny body and released months of pent-up grief. Hope stood perfectly still, allowing the child to bury her face in her neck, absorbing her tears with a patience and compassion that seemed almost human. Marcus found himself crying too, overwhelmed by the raw emotion of what he was witnessing. When Lily finally pulled back, her face streaked with tears but her eyes somehow brighter than before, she looked at Hope with an expression of pure love. And then, in a voice rusty from disuse but unmistakably clear, she spoke. "Thank you." The two words echoed across the paddock like a thunderclap. Lily's grandmother collapsed against the fence, weeping with relief and joy. Eleanor clutched her clipboard to her chest, her professional composure crumbling in the face of a breakthrough she had never dared to expect. And Marcus stood frozen, understanding for the first time the true magnitude of the gift his little filly possessed. From that day forward, Hope became a regular fixture at the therapy center. Week after week, she worked with children who had experienced unimaginable trauma, offering them a safe space to process their pain and begin the long journey toward healing. Her reputation spread quickly, and soon requests were coming in from facilities across the state, all hoping to benefit from her extraordinary abilities. Marcus accompanied her to every session, watching with pride as she transformed lives one child at a time. He saw children who had been diagnosed with severe anxiety learn to calm themselves in her presence. He watched teenagers who had lost all hope rediscover their will to live after spending time with his gentle filly. He witnessed families rebuilt, relationships restored, and futures reclaimed, all because one small horse refused to give up on the people who needed her most. The irony was not lost on him. Hope had come into the world fighting for her very survival, the smallest and weakest of three foals who should never have existed at all. She had been given up for dead, her tiny body cold and still on the surgical table, while doctors fought desperately to save her. And now, the life that had so nearly been lost was being used to save others, to offer hope to those who had none. It seemed fitting, somehow, that she had been named Hope before anyone knew what she would become. Marcus had chosen the name in a moment of desperation, clinging to the belief that she would survive against all odds. Now he understood that the name had been a prophecy, a glimpse of the purpose that had been waiting for her all along. As the first anniversary of the triplets' birth approached, Marcus began planning a celebration that would honor not just their survival, but everything they had come to represent. He invited everyone who had played a role in their story, from Dr. Mitchell and her surgical team, to Lily and her grandmother, to the countless volunteers who helped at the therapy center. It would be a gathering unlike any Thornwood stables had ever seen, a testament to the power of love, perseverance, and the unbreakable bonds between humans and horses. The morning of the anniversary celebration dawned clear and bright, as if the heavens themselves had decided to honor the occasion with perfect weather. Marcus had been awake since before sunrise, too excited and anxious to sleep, making final preparations for the guests who would soon arrive. The paddocks had been decorated with ribbons and flowers, and a large tent had been erected near the main stable to provide shade and seating for the dozens of people expected to attend. Tables laden with food and refreshments lined one side of the tent, while photographs documenting the triplets' remarkable journey adorned the other. As the first guests began to trickle through the gates, Marcus took a moment to stand alone by Bella's paddock. The great mare was grazing peacefully, her black coat gleaming in the morning light, her movements slower than they had once been, but still carrying an undeniable grace. She looked up as he approached, her dark eyes meeting his with the quiet understanding that had characterized their relationship from the very beginning. "1 year ago today, you were supposed to die," Marcus said softly, reaching out to stroke her velvety muzzle. "Everyone had given up on you. Everyone except Dr. Mitchell, and even she wasn't sure you would make it. But here you are, healthy and happy, surrounded by 3 beautiful foals who never should have existed. You proved them all wrong, girl. You proved that miracles are possible." Bella nickered softly in response, pressing her head against his chest, in a gesture of affection that never failed to move him. In that moment, standing in the warm sunshine with the mare who had changed his life, Marcus felt a peace settle over him that he had not experienced since childhood. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever the future might bring, he knew that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The celebration grew throughout the day as more and more people arrived. Dr. Mitchell came with her entire surgical team, each of them eager to see the patients whose lives they had fought so hard to save. They gathered around the triplets' paddock, marveling at how much storm, shadow, and hope had grown, sharing memories of that intense morning when everything had hung in the balance. There were tears and laughter in equal measure, a cathartic release of emotions that had been building since that fateful day. Richard Harrington arrived in his characteristic black Mercedes, but something about him had changed in the year since the triplets' birth. The cold, calculating businessman Marcus had once known had softened somehow, his sharp edges worn down by an experience that had challenged everything he thought he understood about value and worth. He sought out Marcus in the crowd and clasped his hand firmly, his eyes conveying a gratitude that words could not adequately express. "I want to thank you," Richard said, his voice uncharacteristically humble. "Not just for saving these horses, but for saving something in me that I thought was long dead. Watching you fight for them, watching you refuse to give up even when the odds were impossible, it reminded me why I got into this business in the first place. I've spent the last year rethinking everything, and I've made some changes that I think you would approve of." He went on to explain that he had established a foundation dedicated to rescuing and rehabilitating neglected horses across the region. The Bella Foundation, as he had named it, had already saved dozens of animals from slaughter or abandonment, giving them second chances at life, just as Bella had been given hers. Marcus listened in amazement, hardly able to reconcile this passionate advocate with the cold man who had once ordered him to prepare a mare for euthanasia. Perhaps the most touching moment of the day came when Lily arrived with her grandmother. The little girl who had been silent for so long now chattered excitedly about her upcoming birthday party, her favorite subjects in school, and her dreams of one day becoming a veterinarian like Dr. Mitchell. When she saw Hope in the paddock, she ran to the fence and called out the filly's name with the unrestrained joy of a child who has found her best friend. Hope trotted over immediately, her small hooves kicking up little clouds of dust as she hurried to greet Lily. The two of them shared a moment of communion that needed no words, their bond evident in every gesture and glance. Lily's grandmother watched with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks, still amazed by the transformation that Hope had helped bring about in her granddaughter. "She talks about Hope constantly," the grandmother told Marcus, her voice thick with emotion. "Every night before bed, she asks me to tell her the story of how Hope was born, how she almost died, but fought her way back to life. She says it reminds her that no matter how dark things seem, there's always a reason to keep going. Your horse gave my granddaughter back to me, young man. I will never be able to repay that debt." As the afternoon wore on and the shadows began to lengthen across the paddocks, Marcus gathered everyone together for a special ceremony. He had prepared a speech, carefully written and revised over the past several weeks, but when he stood before the assembled crowd, the words on the page seemed inadequate for what he wanted to express. Instead, he spoke from the heart. "1 year ago, I was just a stable hand who happened to notice that something wasn't right with a horse everyone else had written off," he began, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet gathering. "I didn't do anything heroic. I just paid attention. I listened when Bella was trying to tell us that there was more to her story than anyone realized. And because I listened, 3 beautiful lives were brought into this world." He paused, looking around at the faces of the people who had gathered to celebrate this milestone. Friends and strangers, colleagues and supporters, all united by their connection to 4 remarkable horses and the miracle that had brought them together. "But the real hero of this story isn't me," Marcus continued. It's Bella, who carried 3 foals when her body told her it was impossible. It's Dr. Mitchell, who trusted her instincts and refused to accept an easy answer. It's every single person here who believed in these horses when believing seemed foolish. Together, we proved that love and determination can overcome any obstacle. And that's a lesson I will carry with me for the rest of my life. The applause that followed was thunderous, echoing across the fields of Thornwood stables and sending birds scattering from nearby trees. Marcus bowed his head, overwhelmed by the outpouring of support and affection, grateful beyond measure for the community that had formed around his beloved horses. Years passed like pages turning in a well-loved book, each one bringing new chapters to the remarkable story that had begun on that foggy morning when Dr. Mitchell first laid eyes on Bella. Thornwood Stables had transformed from a neglected property into a thriving sanctuary, a place where horses who had nowhere else to go could find safety, healing, and love. The Bella Foundation, which Richard Harrington had established in honor of the Mare who changed his heart, continued to grow and expand its reach, saving hundreds of horses across the country and inspiring similar organizations to spring up in communities far and wide. Marcus, now in his mid-30s, had become a respected figure in the equine world. He was regularly invited to speak at conferences and universities, sharing the story of Bella and her triplets with audiences who never tired of hearing about the miracle that had defied all scientific explanation. But despite his growing reputation, he remained at heart the same humble stable hand who had once knelt in the straw beside a dying mare and refused to give up hope. Every morning, no matter how busy his schedule became, he made time to walk among his horses, to touch their coats and speak their names, to remind himself of what truly mattered in life. Storm had grown into a magnificent mare, her silver-gray coat commanding attention wherever she went. She had fulfilled the promise that trainers had seen in her as a foal, becoming a champion show horse whose grace and intelligence won ribbons and trophies that now filled an entire room at the stables. But Marcus had never pushed her toward competition. Every achievement was Storm's own choice, a reflection of her desire to excel rather than any external pressure. When she was not in the show ring, she roamed the pastures of Thornwood, with the same regal bearing she had displayed from her very first days, a queen surveying her domain. Shadow had taken a different path, one that suited his athletic nature and charismatic personality. He had become a beloved attraction at equine exhibitions and fairs, performing demonstrations of speed and agility that left audiences gasping in amazement. Children especially adored him, and he seemed to return their affection with genuine enthusiasm, always patient when small hands reached out to stroke his glossy black coat. Marcus often joked that Shadow had become the family celebrity, the one who loved the spotlight as much as his siblings preferred the quiet of the pastures. And then there was Hope, the miracle filly whose name had proven prophetic in ways no one could have anticipated. Her work at the therapy center had expanded into a full-fledged program that served hundreds of children and adults each year. She had helped veterans struggling with the invisible wounds of war, survivors of abuse finding their voices for the first time, and countless others who had lost their way in a world that often seemed cruel and unforgiving. Hope approached each person with the same gentle patience, offering her presence as a gift without asking for anything in return. Lily, the first child Hope had helped, had grown into a confident young woman who was now studying veterinary medicine at a prestigious university. She visited Thornwood whenever her schedule allowed, spending hours with Hope and the other horses, never forgetting the debt she owed to the small filly who had drawn her back from the brink of despair. She had promised Marcus that when she completed her training, she would return to work at the stables, continuing the legacy that had begun with a silent cry for help in a makeshift surgical suite. As for Bella, the great mare had lived out her remaining years in the peace and comfort that Marcus had promised her. She watched her foals grow from wobbly newborns into strong, healthy adults, her dark eyes filled with a quiet pride that spoke louder than any words. She was pampered and loved, surrounded by people who understood the sacrifice she had made and honored it with every kindness they could offer. When she finally passed away at the remarkable age of 28, she went peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by the foals she had carried against all odds and the man who had refused to let her die before her time. The day of Bella's passing was one of profound sorrow for everyone at Thornwood Stables. Marcus wept openly, his grief a testament to the depth of the bond they had shared. But even in his sadness, he found comfort in the knowledge that Bella's legacy would live on. Her triplets would continue to touch lives and inspire hope for generations to come. The foundation bearing her name would save countless horses from suffering and neglect. And her story, the story of a giant mare who was scheduled to be put down until doctors saw what was inside her, would be told and retold until it became legend. They buried Bella beneath the old oak tree at the center of Thornwood Stables, the spot where she had loved to stand in the shade during hot summer afternoons. Marcus commissioned a simple stone marker that bore only her name and 2 dates, but everyone who visited knew the extraordinary story behind those simple inscriptions. Storm, shadow, and hope often gathered near the grave, standing in silent vigil as if keeping watch over the mother who had given them life. Sometimes, in the quiet hours of early morning when the mist still clung to the pastures and the world felt suspended between night and day, Marcus would walk to that spot beneath the oak tree and sit beside the stone. He would talk to Bella as if she could still hear him, sharing news of her foals and the latest developments at the sanctuary. And in those moments, when the boundary between past and present seemed to blur, he could almost feel her presence beside him, warm and solid and eternal. The story of Bella and her triplets had started as a tale of impending death, transformed into unexpected life. But it had become something much larger, a testament to the power of paying attention, of refusing to accept easy answers, of believing in miracles even when belief seemed foolish. It was a story about the bonds between humans and animals, about the capacity for redemption that exists in every heart, and about the simple truth that love, when given freely and without reservation, can change the world. If this story touched your heart, please like and share it with others. Leave a comment below telling us how it inspired you. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story. May you always find the courage to believe in miracles, even when the odds seem impossible.